very, it's a blessing, I think to one, join in fellowship with friends that we don't even know, to have family come, and that through Christ and through our unity in Him that we can come together and we can bless each other. And this group, they've come from Dartmouth, and they've been in San Diego for like a week now. And they got a few more days. They're going up to LA, I think, at some point. They've got a lot. They've just been going to places and singing and just really sharing and ministering. And hopefully, being ministered to, like hopefully you've eaten some good food and gotten to see some nice things. I'm sorry, again, that the weather is not warmer for you. It's not this kind of cold San Diego. So come back. You are welcome. But yeah, thank you. Thank you for coming and being with us. We're going to get into today's message, but before that, why don't I pray for us as we enter into a time of God's Word. Father God, Lord, we are filled already, Lord, with your presence, with encouragement, with blessings, Father God. Lord, we look to you, and we look to your Word, Father, to speak to us, Lord, even more. Lord, and we pray, God, that as we listen, Lord, that our hearts would be challenged, our souls, our minds, Lord, would be just clarified, Father God, as we seek after you, as we look to you, Lord. And we pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. So, real quickly, I want you to think back to the last time you would describe somebody as your enemy. Okay, if you have, I know it's a weird question, but I want you to think, maybe you have to go back to like grade school, like, middle school, bullies or something like that. But go ahead, think back. When was the last time there was someone in your life that you would count or qualify as an enemy? It doesn't have to be like all the time, maybe just for a little bit, maybe as a family member. But, go ahead, share that with somebody next to you. Just think about it real quick. Go ahead, share that.
Do you remember anything there?
I hear a lot of talking. It means, some good stories being shared right now.
Clarence is my enemy.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I heard my name. Wonderful. Alrighty. It looks like hopefully maybe you all have an experience. Sorry, I might have to cut your sharing short. I'm going to give you guys a story. First person that comes to mind for me, his name is Scott Weinstein. I hope you don't watch this. In second grade, there was this guy named Scott Weinstein. We played, we were in elementary school together. And here's how this scenario started. I had one friend that I played with every day at recess. His name is Jeremy Footer. Also, well, it doesn't matter. Jeremy Footer was my best friend in second grade. He lived in my neighborhood, so I'd always go over to his house and play games, His mom would like get him the sugary cereal, so I loved going over there and I'd eat the bad cereal. There used to be nerd cereal. There was a cereal with, obviously it wasn't real nerds, but you can just imagine what that was like. And I remember having that over at his place. But we had recess every day, and it was like a scheduled thing. We would meet together and be like, what do you want to do? And I don't know, what do you want to do? Let's go play on the hill. Let's go play kickball. Let's go play foursquare. Whatever it was. One day, I go out to recess, and I'm like, where's Jeremy? And Jeremy's not here. And I look down the field, and Jeremy's playing with somebody else. I know. And he's playing with Scott. And I was like, who are you? When did you come into this picture, Scott? And so, I was very passive, so I didn't do anything. I was like, okay, you can have today. Right? I'll let you have today. And so they played, and I don't know what I did. Maybe I played by myself. And so I was like, okay, you know what, that was one day. Next day, went out to the playground. You know, I was like, it's a different day. He got it out of his system. You know, Jeremy's back to me, right? So like, sounds weird. And so, you know, I go outside and then Jeremy again. He's out over there with Scott. I was like, dang you, Scott. What is going on? What do you have? Do you have sugary cereal also that you bond with Jeremy over? And so you know, and this happened for like a whole week. And I don't know, I did not have the concept of like, hey, let's all play together in my head. Okay, so that was not an option. So at one point at the end of the week, or you know, after a few days this had happened, I like went over and I was like, hey Jeremy, do you want to play? And then Scott was like, we're playing. And I was like, oh, it's on now, right? And I don't know how it escalates in second grade, but we ended up like squaring off, me and Scott, right? And we're on like this sidewalk next to the playground, and we're like, you know, I don't know, it probably didn't look like this, it probably looked like, you know, something like that, right? And we're squaring off, and this is my first fight ever that I'd ever been in. And Scott, I was like, oh, okay, I'm not going to throw the first punch, so I'm going to wait for him to come at me. And he came at me. He didn't come with a punch, he came with a kick. But I was fast, right? So I caught his leg, and I was like, yeah, now what? And then I like, boom, threw it up in the air, and he fell down on his back. And in my head, that's how I thought fights ended. Like when someone's on the ground, it's done, and you win, right? Like I was like, yeah, I won. But then he got back up, and I didn't understand, and I didn't have enough like emotional capacity to handle much more than 30 seconds of a fight. And so he came back. And I was like already wearing out right now. I was like, I don't think I want to do this anymore. And he jump kicked me in the throat, right? And I'm like, ugh. And I just started crying, right? And I'm like, I can't breathe. And I'm crying. And then like him and like Jeremy go off somewhere else, right? Like no teachers, no intervene. And that was the first fight, and I lost. And it was so sad. Scott, right? Like my enemy. I had this Karate Kid moment too, like my dad at some point, I don't think because of this, I don't think I told my parents, but at some point like during this year, he took me to go to karate class with some friends, you know, some other kids in my church were going, so we all go, and I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to learn Taekwondo, and like I'm going to come back and I'm going to train and beat Scott, right? And then I go there and I'm like, I got my white belt, I got my gi, and then there's Scott, who's a blue belt, already in the class. I was like, dang it. I was like, this is my life. So, you know, Scott, you know, and Scott was my enemy. We're talking about enemies today. We're talking about how enemies relate to our lives. And that's a weird thing to say. I know it's like weird to think that you might have an enemy, you know, within, you know, this world, right? But I want to convince you of a few things, and through this passage that we're going to talk about today. And one is that enemies are inevitable. If you are following Christ, if you are following Him as best as you can, right, with your heart, with your soul, with your mind, an enemy or enemies are inevitable. And we're going through Acts. We've been going through Acts, and just set the stage real quick. We're in Jerusalem right now, and this is Paul's last trip to Jerusalem. He's been getting ready to come back to Jerusalem, and as he's been going to Jerusalem, all of these things have been prophesied and told to him. Specifically that he is going to be taken captive, and that this is probably, like, things are not going to end well. Everybody who prophesies to him about going back to Jerusalem tells him, don't go. And all of his brothers and sisters, all these fellow believers are telling him, don't go to Jerusalem. Like, something bad is going to happen to you. And he goes, though. He goes anyways. And this is the beginning of the bad stuff, right? This is the beginning. He just basically came in, he saw the church leaders, and it's been 1 week since, not even 1 week since he's got in, and this is what happened. So if you have your Bibles, you can open up to Acts 21. We have it on the screen too, it's a huge chunk, so I'm going to read through it pretty quickly. and then we're going to talk about enemies. It says this, when the 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help us. This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and our law and this place. And besides, he has brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place." Just quick note on Jewish custom and Jewish law. Israel and Jerusalem was under control of the Roman Empire, but when the Romans took over places, they still allowed the locals to kind of keep their same rules and same structures. It's kind of a way of appeasing them so that they will be a little bit satisfied. They won't feel like too lost, they won't feel like they've lost too much of their identity. And so they allowed the Jewish people to control their own laws of the temple, and one was that you cannot bring a non-Jewish person into the inner courts of the temple. If you do, it's punishable by death. Okay, and so this is what they're accusing Paul of doing. They accused Paul of bringing a non-Jewish person into the inner court of the temple, a place that is set only for Jews. Actually, Paul didn't do it, but I'll continue. Okay, so they had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, in the city with Paul and assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple. The whole city was aroused and people came running from all directions. Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple and immediately the gates were shut. Right? So they bring him in, shut the gates. Okay, it's not, I'm scared. While they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing and some another, and since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Get rid of him." As the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" "Do you speak Greek?" he replied. "Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out into the wilderness some time ago?" So, because there's this huge uproar, because the Jewish people seem to have so much animosity against Paul, the commander mistakes Paul for this one criminal, right, who led like this massive revolt. And Paul's like, "No," right? He says, "I'm actually a Jew, right? Born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city. I studied under, I'm a Jew from Tarsus of Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city. Please let me speak to the people." After receiving the commander's position, Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the crowd. When they were all silent, he said to them in Aramaic. Aramaic is a Jewish dialect. "Brothers and fathers, listen now to my defense." When they heard him speak to them in Aramaic, they became very quiet. Then Paul said, "I am a Jew, born of Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in the city. I studied under Gamaliel and was thoroughly trained in the law of our ancestors. I was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. I persecuted the followers of this way, which is Christians, to their death, arresting both men and women and throwing them into prison, as a high priest and all the council can themselves testify. I even obtained letters from them to their associates in Damascus and went there to bring these people as prisoners to Jerusalem to be punished. About noon, as I came near Damascus, suddenly a bright light from heaven flashed around me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice say to me, 'Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?' 'Who are you, Lord?' I asked. 'I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting,' he replied. My companions saw the light, but they did not understand the voice of him who was speaking to me. 'What shall I do, Lord?' I asked. 'Get up,' the Lord said, 'and go into Damascus. There you will be told all that you have been assigned to do.' My companions led me by the hand into Damascus because of the brilliance of the light had blinded me. A man named Ananias came to see me. He was a devout observer of the law and highly respected by all the Jews living there. He stood beside me and said, 'Brother Saul, receive your sight.' And at that very moment I was able to see. Then he said, 'The God of our ancestors has chosen you to to know his will and see the righteous one and hear words from his mouth. You will be his witness to all people of what you have seen and heard. And now what are you waiting for? Get up, be baptized, and wash your sins away, calling on his name. When I returned to Jerusalem and was praying at the temple, I fell into a trance and saw the Lord speaking to me. Quick, he said, leave Jerusalem immediately, because the people here will not accept your testimony about me. Lord, I replied, these people know that I went from one synagogue to another to imprison and beat those who believe in you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I stood there giving my approval and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him. Then the Lord said to me, go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles. The crowd listened to Paul until he said this. Then they raised their voices and shouted, rid the earth of him. He's not fit to live. As they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air, the commander ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. He directed that he be flogged and interrogated in order to find out why the people were shouting at him like this. As they stretched him out to flog him, Paul said to the centurion standing there, is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty? When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and reported it. What are you going to do? He asked. This man is a Roman citizen. The commander went to Paul and asked, tell me, are you a Roman citizen? Yes, I am, he answered. Then the commander said, I had to pay a lot of money for my citizenship, but I was born a citizen, Paul replied. Those who were about to interrogate him withdrew immediately. The commander himself was alarmed when he realized that he had put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains. Paul goes into Jerusalem, and he doesn't make new enemies, he reignites some old animosities. And Paul comes face to face with his enemies in this passage, and I want to point out a few things about this, but the first thing I want to, and I hope to convince you of, and actually go ahead, I've got a couple premises, and the first one is this, that you cannot live a devoted Christian life without having any enemies. John 15, 18 to 27 is a passage where Jesus is talking to his disciples. Right after he tells them, abide in me and I'll abide in you, he tells them, the world will hate you. He says, as the world has hated me, it will hate you. Right? I have them all printed out. Let me dig through, or I'll just get there. Says this, if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I've chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. Remember what I told you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. If they obeyed my teaching, they will obey yours also. They will treat you in this way because of my name, for they do not know the one who sent me. Goes on to say that, they hated Jesus without reason. But he clearly lays out a fact, right? I don't see there's much way that we can get away from this, that there is some animosity in store for you if you are a believer and you have followed Christ. If you are following Christ, there is in store for you opposition. There is in store for you adversaries. There is in store for you hatred. And this is a hard thing to, I think, really grasp or really understand or accept as Christians. And I think there's a couple of reasons why, which I want to kind of highlight. Right, the first is because I think we might be a little bit proud and naive sometimes, especially when we're growing up. I had this idea, I really like being liked. I don't know if you guys feel the same way. I like it when people say good things about me. I like it when I have a good reputation. I even have it in my mind, basically that if I am a good person to people around me, no matter what their religion, no matter what their faith, no matter what their background, that they will accept and care for me. Or at least understand where I'm coming from. Right? I like to think that if there's a disagreement about some matter of faith that affects them and that they disagree with, that I would be able to have a conversation, right? And somewhere between my eloquence, and their good-naturedness, right, that we will meet somewhere in the middle, and they'll be like, okay, you think this, I understand, I don't think that, we're okay. If that were the case, if really that were the case, then we would be able to achieve something that even Jesus did not do. We would be able to achieve something that Paul could not do. Find some way to express the gospel in a way that would not cause friction, right, between believers and non-believers. In this passage, you'll find it interesting. In this situation, the people that persecuted Paul, the people that hated Paul, they didn't hate Paul because of the gospel. Paul told them all about, hey, this is what happened to me, this is what Jesus said to me, this is all of the things that happened to me, and they listened to him. The point where they got really pissed off and they stopped listening and were ready to kill him was when he said, God has sent me to the Gentiles. Right? The issue wasn't actually the gospel that made them so mad. The issue was that they felt, that God would never do something like that. Right? They were okay with Paul being converted. They were okay with Paul believing in Jesus. Most of the world still saw Christians as part of a Jewish sect, right? So they were in the umbrella of Judaism. So they were kind of more okay with that, but they were mad when they said, God has sent me to the Gentiles. Then they get crazy, right? In the same way, there are certain things about the gospel, there are certain truths about the gospel that maybe people won't disagree with directly, but will affect people in a way that brings animosity to us, that they will not be able to accept. Let me give you a couple of things that that I think are like this. The concept of original sin, that we are born sinners, right? That we are born in sin, that inherently, there is something sinful about it. That's, is part of the gospel, not really the whole gospel thing, but people will not accept that, right? A lot of psychology is based on, the idea that we are naturally good. Right? There are other things, just the fact that we believe that there is a God. The fact that we're a part of any religion. Right? There are enemies, there are people that will just can't accept, and maybe it's not a gospel, they'll be like, Jesus is cool. Right? But I can't accept this part about it. And therefore there will be animosity. Views on abortion. Right? There's a whole, some extremely, biblical, conservative view on men and women. Right? There's all sorts of things that maybe aren't Jesus, but are included in the gospel or included in who God is and His Word that people won't be able to accept. And we have enemies. I'd like to give a couple of examples of some enemies. When we go on missions every year, and a couple years back, apparently, I only found this out last year when we went, but 2 years ago when we went, we were planning, communicating with people, and it was in a closed country, and apparently there are certain people in the local government that heard about our trip going over, right? And it's in Asia, and so, we're mostly Asian, so we kind of blend in pretty well. So actually nothing happened, right? So we were able to, function, pretty well through our trip. But what happened was, shortly or around the same time, another group of people came, for the same purposes, another missions trip. But they were mostly Caucasian, and the government, kind of stopped them, shut them down, and turned them back, right? And it was but the reason why they got turned back is because they thought that they were us, right? And, I just found this out last year. I was like, really? I got really scared, and then, and every year we always have to kind of keep an eye out. not that I'm sure these people, that turned them back, it's not that they hate Jesus, right? There's a threat maybe to government structure, there's a threat to political beliefs, there's some other things about the gospel, right, that they fear. I don't know if you guys know this, but as pastors, if you're clergy of any religion in the United States, you get tax benefits. You get to pay less taxes, actually, than, and it's just a long-standing benefit, that clergy have had. On November 21st in Wisconsin, a group, I believe their name is Freedom from Religion Incorporated, filed a lawsuit in a court which they declared this clergy tax exemption as unconstitutional. Okay, and so basically, what the court found was they said, hey, this is unconstitutional for this tax exemption to be had, right? Obviously, this is going to be appealed. It won't really affect anything right away, but I can easily imagine it's going to go up in courts, right, all the way up to the top. And it's not that I don't know enough about tax law to agree or disagree. Maybe it is unconstitutional. Maybe it's something that we shouldn't be having, right? But I kind of have a feeling that this group, especially since their name is Freedom from Religion, or Incorporated, they have an agenda, right? They have something that they want to stamp out. And I bet you if I ask them, though, they'd be like, oh, it's not Jesus. Jesus is cool. I just don't like religion. And the truth is we will have enemies. Jesus says we will have enemies. But I know we like to think, I know in our hearts we like to think that we wouldn't have any. Another reason why I think it's hard for us to consider the fact that we have enemies is that I think when we think of enemies, we still have a very worldly view and understanding of what enemies are, right? When I think of enemies, I think of Scott Weinstein. A foe, someone that I don't like, that justice must be meted out on, right? When I think of enemies, I think of Hollywood and movies, right? I think of how we treat, opponents and how we just want to see them get beat down, right? Hurt, we want to see justice done to these people, right? Righteous fruit, we just want to see that happen. We teach this in competition, right? One of the things that athletes, are credited for in competition is a killer instinct, right? A wise business decision or a business tactic is something called a hostile takeover, right? The idea of enemies is very, in the world, is a very violent one. And so we understand that that's not quite right, so I don't think I should have any enemies, and the truth is actually that when we say enemies as Christians, we should be thinking something very different. And there are those that will oppose us, but actually our first thought when we hear enemies should be one of love. Right? I think we're afraid to have enemies because we don't want this worldly, we don't want adversaries, right? But when Paul thinks of enemies, he thinks of people he loves. When Paul was coming back to Jerusalem, he knew something bad was going to happen. In fact, he writes to the Romans on his way back into Jerusalem. And in Romans 12, he basically tells them, these Jewish people are enemies to the gospel. But they are loved in regards to the patriarchs, right? He has a high view of Israelites, of Jewish people. And so for Paul, when he thinks enemy, he thinks of somebody that is against me that I love. Jesus, in the same way, in many situations, he reiterates this, right? And says, how are we supposed to treat our enemies? And he says, love your enemies, right? turn the other cheek. And I know, like, we would rather live life not having any adversaries, but the truth is, as we explore and dive into the gospel, like, it's going to happen. And we read passages, there are passages in the Bible that say, like, live in peace, right? As much as you can, live in peace with each other. But actually, looking at that passage is in Romans 11, and he's talking about living in peace in the context of having enemies. And what living in peace means doesn't mean that you don't have enemies, that you don't have conflict with people, but it means that when the conflict happens, that you do everything you can in your power to show love. Right? It means that you do everything that you can when the conflict happens, because it's going to happen, that you reach outside, right? That you don't see them in the way the world defines an enemy, right? But you see it in the way that Jesus Christ defined an enemy, that we still love in the context of our conflict. It's tell me who would have a better chance of seeing and experiencing love. Someone that I never offend, or someone that I offend but yet try so desperately hard to show that I care for them even when we disagree. Right? Someone that by blood, by tears, by action, by sweat, right, I offer myself as a punching bag, as a sacrifice, right, to bridge the conflict that happens, even though, that conflict will be there. I think, we try so hard not to offend, and we think that we're living in peace, but I think if we try so hard not to offend, we just live in passivity. But we're not supposed to make enemies, right? That's another problem of the church, is sometimes we said, oh, we have enemies in the world, and we start treating them like the world treats enemies, right? And we're like, we hate them, we don't like them, we don't want to do anything with them. We want to protect ourselves from them, we want to keep them away. And that's not what Christ says when it comes to enemies. He says, no, you will have adversaries, you have people that will, by nature, not accept things about your gospel, about your truth, about who you are, about what you believe. But in the context of that conflict, you are meant to reach out, right? Reach over and bring love. Right? Bring truth. Right? Bring healing. We can't treat enemies, like we'll fail horribly if we start accepting the fact that we have enemies and start treating them like the world treats their enemies. The church only succeeds, Christianity only succeeds if we understand we have enemies, we understand people come in conflict with us, but no matter what, we are committed to showing love to them. Paul knew he had enemies in Jerusalem. He came to the church in Jerusalem to show them, that he cared for them. He was in the middle of a Jewish purifying ritual to show how much that he was trying to abide by Jewish customs when they took him. It said when the 7 days were not yet over, he was in a 7-day purifying ritual that he didn't need to do, to show that he was, trying as hard as he could to abide by, Jewish customs and Jewish laws, that he affirmed the Jewish law. Right? He was doing everything he could. But here's the last part. It didn't work. They still took him, they still beat him, they still threatened him. And somewhere along the lines, that we have to have a similar mindset to Paul. That we sometimes in our conflicts, we're trying to bridge an impossible gap. I think so hard about how we as a church are going to somehow show love to, especially like a community like the homosexual community. And it feels like an impossible gap sometimes. Right? But we have to do something. have to find some way, even in the conflict. You know, what do we do? Do we volunteer? Do we help out? Do we just make friends? Do we get into communities? What do we do? I don't know. Right? It doesn't seem like we'll resolve it by doing much, but it's not about whether we resolve it. It's about because Christ has called us to treat those that are against us a certain way that we do. We can't be passive. Right? We have to reach through conflict. And that living in peace is not about not having conflict, but it's about how you act through it. We are way over time. There's a little bit more, but I think that's something we can really consider for us. You know, that it's going to happen. Opposition will happen. It's inevitable. We have no way out of it. Jesus said so. But there's a way we're supposed to move through it that is radical. And in that, Christ will be glorified. Now, let me pray for us as we just dismiss. Father God, Lord, we just thank you for your example in Christ, Lord, that even while we were your enemy, Lord, in sin, that you reached across what seemed like an impossible void, an impossible gap, Lord, to bridge over and show love to us. Lord, and God, you call us to the same. You call us to do what you have done, Lord. And I pray, God, that you would help us as we meet opposition, that we would not react, Lord, the way that the world would have us react to enemies, Lord, but that we would be able to move with love that is supernatural, Lord, that is from you, and in it see a transformed life in us, Lord, and praise your name and glorify you in our words, actions, and thoughts. Now we ask that you would be with us as we go from here.